It's a great personal honor to be here to speak to you. And I want to thank Andy Bibby and all the people at the center for making me feel so welcome and for making it possible for me to appear with such a great roster of distinguished scholars. When you work on a book, as I did on Scalia for 8 years, you do it pretty much by yourself, with your wife doing editing and kibitzing. And it's so great to see many of the people who I have gotten to know through their writing and through their work, and to meet them personally. Beyond thanking the center for their hospitality, I want to say something to the students here. I went to a school very much like your school, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, in the late 1960s. It wasn't open enrollment, but it was pretty darn close. It cost $5 to apply. The tuition was $200 a year. And it changed my life. I was going to be a defense lawyer. I ended up as a professor of constitutional law. We didn't have a Center for Constitutional Studies. I had Dean Alphonse Jr. and Sheldon Goldman, who pointed me in this direction. And you are all so lucky to have a wonderful center here, and all of the other professors and programs that you have to give you a world of possible avenues and information and paradigms to follow in pursuing your career. And so I'm very jealous for the journey that you're on, and I wish you all the best of luck. And I thank you for staying here all day long. It's hard for academics to sit all day long and listen to other people talk. That's not our instinct. We want to have our say. We're glad to finally appear before you. I was invited here to discuss Antonin Scalia's legacy off the court and say something about his biography, and to explain how his extrajudicial behavior has further politicized the Supreme Court, in my opinion. My research on Antonin Scalia's pre-court life led me to see two sides to his personality, dating back to his years studying at Georgetown University. He was Tony Scalia, the affable and charismatic dramatic actor who became the life of parties, played the piano, and sang show tunes and operas. And he was also Nino Scalia, the brilliant, take-no-prisoner, championship college debater. He may well have been the best college debater in the late 1950s in the United States. I love to argue, Scalia would later tell interviewers. In choosing Scalia over Robert Bork for the Supreme Court in 1986, President Reagan had been told that Scalia would take on a third persona, the William Brennan of the right. Reagan's advisors all believed that Scalia would unite the court's conservatives under the new Chief Justice, William Rehnquist, just as Brennan had done for the liberal Chief Justice, Earl Warren, throughout the 1960s. Typical of this prediction was that of Court of Appeals Judge Michael McConnell, who said, quote, "I will predict you will not see him running off and writing separate opinions merely because he takes exceptions with small issues or details. He believes it is important to the country for the court to get together and to speak with a single voice, to provide actual resolution to the issues." Judge McConnell couldn't have been more wrong, and everybody agreed with his view. Scalia wanted to speak with one voice, as we all know, as long as it was his voice. It was not Tony Scalia who showed up on the first Monday in October to charm and unite his more senior colleagues, but rather the more argumentative Nino Scalia, who sought to prove from the outset that he was their equal. From the opening of court in 1986, Nino sought to dominate oral argument and steal the very first opinion that term in a minor Native American inheritance law case from Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. For the rest of his time on the bench, Scalia behaved, as I titled my biography of him, like a court of one, and he did this both on and off the court. Scalia joined a court in 1986 that had been, with very few exceptions, largely abstaining from off-the-bench political behavior. The justices were forced to seek to restore their judicial independence after the forced resignation of Abe Fortas in 1969 because of allegations of financial impropriety, and the impeachment threat a year later against Justice William O. Douglas because of his controversial financial and personal off-the-bench behavior. Scalia began to test those normative limits 3 years later. Still stewing in the summer of 1989 about Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's vote to uphold Roe v. Wade in the Webster Planned Parenthood case involving abortions, he began what became his pattern on the court, writing and delivering speeches to answer his colleagues' opposing decisions, while also furthering his off-the-bench intellectual agenda at his own pace. He wrote and delivered 3 speeches at colleges that year, 2 of which later became influential law review articles, in arguing that words of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights could best be understood, as you've learned all day long, by determining their founding era original public meaning. And, Scalia added, should these interpretations disagree with important precedents or lines of precedents, he would be a faint-hearted originalist and would be inclined to uphold those precedents. All of these speeches and writings were comfortably within the existing normative bounds governing extrajudicial behavior by Supreme Court justices as of 1970. The next step in his off-the-bench journey came after he dissented in 11 straight cases at the end of the 1995-1996 term. This is when VMI happened. Scalia took these defeats badly, complaining in a free speech and political patronage case that his judicial colleagues were, quote, day by day, case by case, busy designing a constitution for a country I do not recognize. Depressed by these losses, that summer, Scalia wrote the retired Justice Harry Blackmun, quote, I am more discouraged this year than I have been at the end of my previous 9 terms up here. I'm beginning to repeat myself and don't see much use in it anymore. As it turns out, we learned after Scalia's death, at this point in his life, he almost had a chance to change his career direction. Future Speaker of the House John Boehner explored with him the idea of joining Republican presidential ticket with Bob Dole. Scalia, Boehner recalled, didn't say yes, but he also didn't say no. Later, Scalia would tell Boehner, just as Justice and later future Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes had said when approached about being drafted to run as a Republican for the president against Woodrow Wilson in 1916, quote, the possibility is too remote to comment upon, given my position. No one, including Bob Dole, could miss the message here that Hughes, in fact, ran for president and narrowly lost. So Scalia was added to the list of potential VP candidates, but the choice went to Jack Kemp. 4 years later, in 2000, Scalia began to change through his off-the-bench behavior into a much more political and at times even theocratic figure. Supreme Court reporter Kim Eisler and columnist Bob Novak reported that Scalia was rumored to be threatening in Washington circles to retire if Al Gore won the presidency. As it turned out, Scalia personally played a major role in avoiding that prospect by single-handedly persuading Anthony Kennedy to vote for George W. Bush's side in the landmark Bush v. Gore case. Shortly thereafter, Scalia, the devoutly conservative pre-Vatican II Catholic that his father had raised him to be, began speaking at various conferences and religious colleges on religious themes such as the need for schools such as Georgetown to maintain their, quote, Catholic identity, and for Catholics in places like Mississippi to fight against the secularization of American society by becoming, quote, fools for Christ. He also spoke at places like Villanova, where I heard him, about his pre-Vatican II pro-death penalty views as opposed to Pope John Paul's, quote, sanctity of human life posture. In responding to questions from the audience about his disagreement with the Pope, Scalia argued that since the pontiff had not spoken ex cathedra on the matter, the justice chose instead to observe the views of 2 millennia of earlier popes. During this period, Scalia became embroiled in one off-the-bench controversy after another. Members of the press were barred from a Cleveland Awards banquet where he was to receive a Freedom of Press Defense Award. Scalia told a Knight of Columbus group that under God should remain in the Pledge of Allegiance while a case testing that provision was on its way to his court, thus forcing his recusal. And in the most controversial of these episodes, he went duck hunting in Louisiana with a group including Vice President Dick Cheney, who was then involved in a case before the court dealing with an oil company energy commission that Cheney chaired at the White House. When he was asked to recuse himself from the case, Scalia refused and wrote a 21-page memorandum explaining why he did so. Later, he told a group that remaining on the bench to hear that case was, quote, the proudest thing I have ever done. It turns out that the controversial Cheney duck hunting trip was hardly an unusual occurrence for Scalia. After his death, a new Social Science Research Network article posted by Washington attorney Stephen R. Bruce, titled, Any Good Hunting? When a Justice's Impartiality Might Reasonably Be Questioned, makes clear that Scalia went on roughly 10 gifted, 2-day, high-end hunting trips a year over a 20-year period. Mr. Bruce shows that these trips at many of the best hunting ranches in the nation were used to attract Scalia to give a speech in the area. They went largely unreported under the federal financial ethics requirements because there was, quote, a personal hospitality exception, by which you did not need to report so long as the owners of the ranches or members of their families were enlisted to invite the justice to hunt and participated themselves in the hunt. More than just serving as a speech-making magnet for an outdoor recreation for Scalia, Mr. Bruce shows that many of the ultra-conservative businessmen, industrialists, politicians, and even former federal judges participated in these hunts, thus providing the justice with an ideological echo chamber where he could receive political information and adulation. In a speech delivered in Australia, Scalia's comments became somewhat more extreme. He's described those jurists who were living, evolving constitutionalists, the ones which were guided by, quote, the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society, as being, in his words, the mullahs of the West. No one could miss that this list would include his 4 liberal colleagues on the Supreme Court. Scalia argued instead for a reliance on his founding-era originalism version of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, subject to voters who amended the Constitution rather than basing the decisions on the majority will of 5 liberal lawyers on the court. By the spring of 2005, after several years of controversial off-the-bench behavior, and with Chief Justice William Rehnquist then suffering from terminal thyroid cancer, Scalia tried to rebrand himself for a possible elevation to the center seat. He went on what journalists called a charm offensive in speaking off the court. He gave a speech at the Woodrow Wilson Center at the Library of Congress, explaining how his originalism now used a greater variety of historical sources to determine the meaning of the words of the founding documents as understood by the people attending the state ratifying conventions. Making his speech even more unusual, after refusing for so many years to allow his speeches to be filmed or videotaped or even recorded, he allowed this one to be streamed on the internet, took extensive questions for the speech, and the streaming was later sold by C-SPAN on DVD. After Scalia failed to be named Chief Justice, he behaved in 2006 as if he felt freed from any further career ambitions or obligations. He embarked on a somewhat controversial Dead Constitution tour, telling a Federalist Society meeting in Puerto Rico that his living, evolving constitutionalist colleagues had, quote, idiotic ideas. Of fellow conservative originalist Clarence Thomas, who was much more willing to overturn precedents, Scalia said, quote, I'm a textualist, I'm an originalist, I am not a nut. A highlight for me in doing my research was finding on the internet a freelance digital file of Scalia arguing with over 100 students and faculty members at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. Scalia didn't seem to realize that he was being recorded by 2 men in the second row. The audience, who spoke much better English than Scalia had expected, put him on trial for the Bush administration's policies, the Bush administration's war on terror, as well as random Rehnquist court decisions. It was there that Scalia said he would never vote for war on terror suspects because, quote, I had a son on that battlefield, and they were shooting at my son, and I am not about to give a man who was captured in a war a full jury trial. I mean, it's crazy. When some military generals requested that Scalia recuse himself from the next war on terror case, Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, he once again refused to step down. The following year, Scalia told a radio BBC broadcaster, after saying the year before in Canada that he was a big fan of Jack Bauer of the 24 television series, that in his opinion it was now okay for government investigators to, quote, smack a terrorism suspect and torture him in interrogations. In all of these actions, Scalia now was known in the law blogs as, quote, the rock star of 1 Street, and he remained the most controversial, extrajudicially active justice we have ever had, based on my study going back to Brandeis, Frankfurter, Abe Fortas, and William O. Douglas. In doing so, he helped to turn the Supreme Court, in my opinion, into a partisan target for the press, politicians, and the general public. Scalia's practice of speaking so forthrightly off the court encouraged others on the bench to do the same. Between 2004 and 2008, Scalia's annual number of speaking appearances doubled from 15 to 30. At the same time, Stephen Breyer's and Anthony Kennedy's appearances also roughly doubled to 23 and 20 respectively. As the rules governing extrajudicial appearances by members of the court changed, so did the politicization perceived by the general public of the institution. By 2010, Scalia was then in his mid-70s and into the winter of his judicial career. That year, he joined Anthony Kennedy and 3 other conservatives on the court in the Citizens United case to extend the unlimited right of free speech for corporations in making elections contributions. This decision triggered another off-the-bench controversy involving Scalia when it was discovered that he had spoken earlier at a political strategy and fundraising seminar organized for wealthy conservative political donors by the ultra-conservative billionaire Koch brothers at an exclusive desert resort in Indian Wells, California. It's not known what Scalia said or how much he interacted with the participants, but his mere appearance at the event raised even more questions because Scalia never mentioned it in his financial ethics. Instead, he listed the trip as being funded by the Federalist Society, which the organization later admitted had no group nearby. Common Cause protested this appearance in a letter to Attorney General Eric Holder, Jr., calling for a Justice Department investigation into any link between this appearance and the Citizens United decision, which might call for a reconsideration of the case. Though nothing came of the letter, the negative press in the Washington Post made clear that Scalia had once again placed the court into a partisan cauldron by his off-the-bench activities. By now, the Supreme Court was perceived by the public as a much more politicized institution. One poll taken before the vote in the Sebelius Affordable Care Act case found that 75% of the general public believed that the justices would be more likely to be, quote, influenced by, quote, politics in making their decision on the future of Obamacare rather than, quote, based solely on legal merits. And now, the institution that once received 56% of the general public's confidence for its work in the late 1980s and over 60% before that, saw its Gallup public approval rating drop to roughly 30% since 2014, a historic low. My story today has been about the extrajudicial legacy of Antonin Scalia, but it will end with some political commentary this summer by his dearest friend on the court, the 83-year-old liberal icon, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. This past summer, Ginsburg discussed on the record with New York Times reporter Adam Liptak her fears about the prospect of Republican Donald Trump winning the presidency. In the article, she quoted her late husband, Martin, saying, "Now it's time for us to move to New Zealand." 3 days later, Justice Ginsburg told CNN court reporter Joan Biskupic and judicial biographer of Donald Trump, quote, "He is a faker. He has no consistency about him. He says whatever comes into his head at the moment. He really has an ego." After enduring nearly unanimous negative press commentary about her statements by a sitting justice in an election year about a candidate for the presidency, Justice Ginsburg apologized to the nation, but not necessarily to Mr. Trump, writing, quote, "On reflection, my recent remarks in response to press inquiries were ill-advised, and I regret making them. Judges should avoid commenting on a candidate for public office. In the future, I will be more circumspect." As far as I can determine, Justice Ginsburg's comments are unprecedented in the court's history. The closest thing I could find were alleged comments made by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor on the night that the Bush v. Gore ballots were being counted. Were Justice Ginsburg asked to explain why she spoke in this fashion, I think she might well have said, "Well, Nino behaved like this as a private citizen with free speech rights off the court. Why can't I?" Longtime Washington Post court reporter Ruth Marcus provided an answer to this question, writing, quote, "Ginsburg's remarks, like Scalia's duck hunting, present a problem and not just for her. They drag the court down to the level of other political actors into the partisan muck. They reinforce the public's perception that this game, too, is rigged more than it actually is. Judges aren't the neutral umpires mechanically calling balls and strikes of Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr.'s imagining. but they can aspire to that ideal and should, on and off the bench. I believe that Ruth Marcus is absolutely correct here. It is my firm belief that Justice Ginsburg's comments, when compared to where the court's informal normative standards for extrajudicial behavior were in 1986, provide the best evidence we have of Justice Scalia's impact on the prevailing standards for Supreme Court justices off the bench. Time alone will tell whether that legacy, which I argue has further politicized the court, will prove to be as positive as his many substantial judicial opinion and legal philosophical contributions that we've heard about today. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation.